Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the art historical lecture for Unit 10 on the High Modernist period. And one thing I wanted to say, just pause for a second and let's look at what we have seen and think about the what we saw in the lecture on the early part of modernism, how we went from a very kind of like more neutral and brown and earth-based palettes to the much more colorful paintings of, like, let's say Monet and Van Gogh. And then here, where the colors and the organization of paintings is becoming so much more diverse and just um, so much more saturation, intensity. But anyway, so getting back to Matisse, as I was saying, um, Matisse, in some ways, I think you could see him as having some similarities with the intimist artists, and some aspects of being something of an expressionist. But more and more, it was for him about decision making in terms of how to make painting, and he would and aiming for a certain kind of um, economy and simplicity to a painting, but also like checking. Take a look at this just for a second. Like, look at this on the plate. That just really elegant brush painting uh, reproduction that he does there. Atelier Rouge just means red room. One of the things that Matisse did a lot, especially towards the end of his career, was a lot of work with cut paper, where he would hand paint paper in tempera and then hand cut and make um, and he did a whole book called Jazz, which is beautiful. I recommend if you have the money. It's definitely worth owning. Okay, we moving onward to Braque. So another thing that kind of ties. So one of the main things we talked about was this interest in individuality and in expression. Another thing that ties a lot of the art of the High Modernist period is an interest in representation and in how and perception. How do we see and how do we represent what we see? Um, and how are there ways of making representations of what we see that could be new, that represent new ways of seeing things? And some of that begins, I think, a lot with color. So some of the color ideas of Bonnard and how it's a continuation of the color ideas of Seurat and the color ideas of Monet. We can see that kind of idea. But Braque, and then later Picasso with Braque, they were aiming for a new kind of idea about how art could be about seeing. And this very much comes out of the paintings of Cezanne, but really trying to find a way to, let's go back to this one for a second. And I think you can, in this landscape, you can really see the Cezanne sort of influence and the breaking up of things into planes. And I think what they found from Cezanne and that breaking things up into planes was it started to create an impression of like each moment in the painting got to be seen as its own individual moment, so that like each little facet or plane represented a slightly different point of view or a slightly different moment of time of the looking. And you can kind of see that in something like this very cubist bottle and fishes. And so it's an interesting kind of thing that in the act of kind of breaking up the seeing into moment by moment, so trying to make a painting be a very, very um, truthful representation of the seeing moment by moment. By the breaking up of everything, then you lose the whole, and so the image becomes quite abstract, and not only abstract but quite hard to read. It requires thought and effort to look and be like, oh, there's the fish. Um, and Picasso started out, kind of in a different sort of direction, but was also kind of very quickly influenced by Cezanne and strongly influenced by Braque himself. And the two of them were, moving in this direction of like trying to make images that were about this kind of like about a new way of seeing. And then that led to them kind of each come up with their own very kind of personal languages of how to reorganize shapes for the purposes of painting. Someone like Leger also kind of took this idea, was strongly influenced by the Cubist works of Picasso and Braque, but took it in his own direction. He was much more interested in always kind of like making everything, trying to keep this idea of solidity, of the physicality of stuff in his paintings. And then we have Kandinsky. And so I think with someone like Kandinsky, we see multiple trends. One of the things we see is for a while in his career, this kind of this idea of personal expression. Kandinsky is often credited with making the first truly non-objective painting, meaning that it's a painting just of marks on the surface with no representation and no kind of imagery as a starting point, that it was purely just a grouping of marks on a surface. That said, you can start to see that the more you look at these paintings, the more you realize that many of them had definite imagery ideas contained in them. They were so, but he's began to move more towards a direction of kind of organizing things in terms of simpler and more geometric shapes. And that was definitely part of the development of why we have the Suprematist movement. And probably the most famous painter of the Suprematist movement is Kazimir Malevich. And here I have an early painting, a 1918 white on white, and then a painting much more from later in his career, a self-portrait. And I think to me, one of the interesting things about it is, even though this painting is a non-objective painting, this painting is a self-portrait, is a figurative painting, you can see that the artist is very similar in how he thinks about design and organization. There's a lot of the suprematist in this self-portrait painting as well. And so the suprematists really bring up a new kind of, I think, a topic in this story of different ideas of what modernism should be about, where is it going, and that is this idea of essentialism, of paint trying to boil down to its most essential elements, and a painting becoming just about the simple organization of line and shape and color and value on a surface of a painting, and not trying to hide what a surface is. Interestingly enough, these Mondrian compositions stem directly out of paintings that were originally based on trees, and just starting to break the tree up into an organization of verticals and horizontals led to a lot of these type compositions. And they are really amazing to see, especially in person. They have a very nice one from this period at the High Museum in Atlanta. If you ever have a chance to go and see it, I strongly recommend it. And now, I don't know how much time, I don't know if we can quite do it. We just have a little bit of time. We have a minute. And so I just want to talk about this kind of return to expressionism. So we see that in artists like Oskar Kokoschka. I love this painting, it's so crazy. Paul Klee going in a very more personal and individual kind of direction. And then lastly, I just want to go back to Kokoschka for a second. Kokoschka is one of my favorite painters of all time. And I just love the way he paints. And I think him and Max Beckmann are probably the two great modernist expressionist painters. And unfortunately, we don't have time to cover Beckmann or Otto Dix for that matter. But I love this painting. And Paul Klee, just such a unique individual voice. I love these paintings where he would draw with printer's ink and then watercolor over the top, and the textures that he would create with that. And lastly, Marcel Duchamp. We're going to talk a little bit more about Marcel Duchamp when we talk about the end of modernism and the beginning of postmodernism. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you.